Hello and welcome to another podcast from Odell Technology. Today we're honoured to be joined by Dr. Gavin Koh, an infectious diseases specialist and a drug developer. Hello, Gavin.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for setting this up and thank you for inviting me to speak to you.
Not a problem, and thank you very much for joining us. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind telling the audience a little bit about your past, who you are, and how you ended up where you are today.
Thank you very much. I'm originally from Singapore, but I currently work in the UK. My background is as an infectious diseases physician, and I trained in Oxford, Birmingham, and in Cambridge, and I took a PhD in tropical medicine from Cambridge. I currently also have an honorary contract with Northwick Park Hospital in Northwest London as an infectious diseases consultant, but I've actually worked in industry for 10 years in malaria, tuberculosis, and most recently COVID-19. I thought I would say a little bit about infectious diseases as a specialty because that's been such an important part of my life. When I first started at medical school, I thought I might be a surgeon. And then I thought after that, maybe I might be a cardiologist. But I soon realized that single disease specialties were really quite boring. I didn't think I could do that for my entire working life, if that was going to be 20 or 30 years. I couldn't do 30 years of cardiac manifestations of ischemic heart disease. I couldn't just see diabetes for 30 years. I couldn't just do knee operations for 30 years. And the wonderful thing about infectious diseases is the sheer variety. And from now until the end of the human race, the only new diseases will be infectious diseases.
So what's it like being an infectious diseases physician, particularly in the pandemic?
I think that the word pandemic is the subject of Hollywood movies. If it appears on the front page of your newspaper, it's something that strikes fear into people's hearts. And most people's immediate instinct is to run away. I think what makes an infectious diseases physician different is we run towards these things. It's the most exciting point in your career. It's what you've actually trained to do. It is the one point in your entire career probably where you get to shine, to actually do what you've always wanted to do, to actually get your hands dirty and to say, I know what to do next. And everybody looks to you to say, what's going to happen?
You've been at Northwick Park and you've worked with Eversheld at AstraZeneca.
Yes, that's right. And the first part of the pandemic, I was in the middle of a complicated tuberculosis trial, and then the pandemic hit. And of course, everything just ground to a halt because of lockdowns, travel restrictions. You couldn't actually get patients. You couldn't get samples in and out of countries, in and out of sites, couldn't move patients around. And that's when I realized that all of the action was actually happening on my doorstep.
Okay.
I was doing 1 day a week at Northwick Park Hospital as an honorary consultant. And the thing about Northwick Park Hospital is its geography. It is the closest hospital to Heathrow Airport. And within the UK, the very first COVID-19 patient to be ventilated was actually at Northwick Park Hospital. The first ambulance, the first blue light in the whole of the UK was to the intensive care unit at Northwick Park Hospital. And I'm proud and honored to say that it was my colleagues in the intensive care unit there who had actually been practicing for 2 weeks before that point, because they saw They saw it coming. They knew it was going to happen. How they were actually going to care for, under strict isolation conditions, a patient, very sick patient. And they executed it wonderfully, really. I was not literally on the front line. I have to say, I helped out because I'm not a full-time jobbing clinician. I'm mainly a researcher. I was responsible mainly for keeping the outpatient service of the infectious diseases department running while my hospital specialist colleagues actually maintained the wards, which then started to overflow with COVID-19 patients.
Tell me, when did you know that the pandemic was real? At what point?
When it first starts appearing in the newspapers and you see it's in China, you think, well, maybe it will just burn itself out. And a lot of these things actually do. But I'm originally from Singapore. And what people may remember is that Singapore had experience with SARS in 2003. Singapore learned a lot of the hard lessons. SARS, remember, had a 20% mortality rate, much higher than COVID-19. Singapore learned about face masks, strict isolation of infected patients, and so forth, and temperature controls, travel restrictions, and so forth. And a lot of Singaporeans actually died. Those were guidelines, policies learned and built from blood, actual blood, right? Actual deaths. When COVID-19 came round, we knew that it was a very similar virus. And Singapore put in a lot of the guidelines, the controls that it had put in 2003 in SARS. But then things started to break down. We learned that a lot of COVID-19 patients didn't have a fever, which meant that the fever screening that was used during SARS didn't actually work. A lot of patients with COVID-19 were actually minimally symptomatic or even asymptomatic. Now, what happened with SARS is that if you got SARS, you knew you had SARS, you were ill. Nobody had to tell you to self-isolate. You just went to bed of your own accord. This was very different. You had a lot of people mildly symptomatic wandering around shopping centers, giving disease to anybody and everybody they actually met. But the key thing was hospitals in Singapore started seeing patients from around the region, from countries that claimed they had no COVID-19. Now that's a huge disconnect. Singapore was very good at testing, and so had a very good handle on how many cases they actually had. But when you have neighboring countries saying they have 0 cases, but yet they are exporting COVID-19 cases to Singapore for treatment, you know that there is something seriously wrong and there is no control on it. At that point, I knew this was going to be a global pandemic, because it wasn't like SARS, where everything was locked down really quickly, and within a few months, it was eradicated.
Is the pandemic over?
And that's a great question. In terms of the disease, clearly not, because what we know is that COVID-19 is here to stay with us. There's a really interesting modeling exercise that the Economist published on the 23rd of May, where the Economist looked at mortality rates, global mortality rates, after and before the pandemic. And from what you would predict, that global mortality is actually about 5% higher than where it was before the pandemic. And that is probably attributable to COVID-19. It's a small fraction, but it is there. The WHO declared that the pandemic was over on the 5th of May. But I think what that means is only that the extraordinary measures that were in place, travel restrictions, mandatory vaccination, face masks and all those kinds of recommendations that are actually quite inconvenient, quite restrictive, damaging to the economy. Those measures should all be stood down. But that's not to say that COVID-19 isn't with us anymore. That isn't to say that COVID-19 is not continuing to do damage worldwide, and in particular to immunocompromised patients. Remember that vaccines only work if you have an immune system. If you have no immune system, you can give somebody vaccines until the cows come home, and it does not protect them. So we're talking about cancer patients. We're talking about patients who are immunosuppressed because of rheumatological disease, rheumatic arthritis, for example, rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, that's actually a significant chunk of patients who continue to be vulnerable. But from the WHO's point of view, and this is quite important, these same people, remember, are also at risk of influenza, for example. So the argument then is, should you be having these restrictions in place when you don't do the same thing for influenza? That's the kind of balancing act that an organization like the WHO has to take, that kind of judgment.
I see. What do you think we should do next?
I think that the key bit here is not to forget the lessons. The swine flu pandemic, and remember, pandemics come every 10 years or so, right? But they're not always so disruptive. The swine flu pandemic of 2009 was a pandemic, but we didn't take the right lessons from it. We dodged a bullet. Swine flu, when it burnt through the world in 2009, we saw at that point that a lot of the pandemic controls that were in place weren't really working. Otherwise, it wouldn't have burnt through as quickly as it did. But mortality from swine flu was actually less than seasonal flu. And so the impact of swine flu, even though it infected the entire world within a very short space of time, was actually less than that of seasonal flu. We dodged a bullet. And many people, policymakers in particular, came away with the wrong message, which is, oh, we obviously overreacted. We shouldn't spend so much on pandemics and pandemic planning because, look, we've just had a pandemic. And although everything didn't really work very well, it's fine. Not a lot of people died. Well, that's nothing to do with the systems. It was because we were lucky. And you can't base pandemic planning on luck. I worked on Evusheld, which is a preventive antibody combination. It does both treatment and prevention, actually. And it is targeted against COVID-19. And early on in the pandemic, before there's a vaccine, you can already have monoclonal antibodies. And I therefore believe that monoclonal antibodies are a critical part of any future pandemic response. The first reason is because clinical development is quick. You have an excellent safety profile. Why? This is an antibody, and every adult human being has about 20 to 30 grams of IgG antibody in your circulation against pathogens, against germs that are outside of you. This is versus an average dose of monoclonal antibody of about 500 milligrams to 1 gram. And that means you can take steps that you can't do in small molecules. So antivirals, for example, conventional small molecule antivirals. So just to give you an example of Regeneron's strategy for their antibody development, they went in with a very high dose, 3 grams to begin with. And then after they actually received emergency use authorization in the US. They slowly brought the dose down, all the way down, I think, to about 500 milligrams. You cannot do that for a small molecule. With a small molecule, the drug development paradigm is completely the opposite because you don't know the side effect profile. It is unpredictable. You start with a very small dose, usually of the order of only 1 to 10 milligrams at the most, and then you go up by baby steps to see whether or not you actually encounter any safety problems. And then if you do encounter safety problems, it is a very long cycle time to fixing the safety problems and coming up with a new molecule. You just don't have these problems with monoclonal antibodies. The other thing about monoclonal antibodies is that you can use them for treatment as well as prevention, which means that in the early stages of a pandemic, I think that monoclonal antibodies are actually a critical part of any pandemic response. And as I said, history has shown us you will get a pandemic once every 10 years or so. I think that what we need is to take those lessons and to understand them. Number one, the regulatory pathways have to be there, and they have to be specific to monoclonal antibodies. The US emergency use authorization pathway was definitely a positive thing for the US. Europe, to be honest, the pathway is a little bit slower. They definitely worked very hard to actually get their authorizations, but they were still months behind. And in the middle of a pandemic, even a month is actually a lot of deaths. I think the second thing is manufacturing capacity. During the pandemic, once again, you couldn't get manufacturing capacity. Most monoclonal antibodies that are currently on the market are actually cancer treatments, immunology treatments. They are for fairly uncommon diseases, and therefore the manufacturing capacity for each of these treatments, it tends to be quite small. And a lot of bioreactors are only about 1,000 liters, 2,000 liters. In a pandemic, what you need is 20,000 liter bioreactors. And there are very few of these in the world. In fact, most countries don't have any at all. Most of this manufacturing capacity is US, only a couple of countries in Europe, South Korea and China, and that's it. And these places are supposed to supply the entire world. I think there is promise there because the same kind of technology is currently being used to create synthesized meat, cell culture meat products, because it's basically cell cultures, right? Cell cultures are what you use to have non-animal meat products, but actually cell cultures are also what you use to produce antibodies. And it may be that the big manufacturing breakthroughs will actually come from that part of the industry. It's not exactly the same, but the technological advances are something I think are applicable across the two fields. And then in terms of manufacturing, one of the key things there is once you can scale up, which is what you need for a pandemic, you can bring the cost of goods down. Because at the moment, monoclonal antibodies cannot cover the entire world because they are 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more expensive to produce per unit than a vaccine. And then the third thing is how you actually give monoclonal antibodies. Regeneron, when their product was bought by the US government, a lot of it ended up sitting on shelves for about 6 months. It couldn't be used. And the reason is because you had highly infectious patients who needed the drug as quickly as possible, but nowhere to give the injections. Now, a lot of hospitals have infusion centers, but those infusion centers are for your cancer patients, for your rheumatology patients who are vulnerable. And the last thing you want is to put your vulnerable patients in the same room as your infected patients. And it was a major logistic nightmare to figure out how you could actually do it in such a way that you didn't put at risk precisely the patients you were trying to protect. They had to create separate facilities or divide up facilities or segregate facilities, retrain staff in infection control protocols, because trying to protect a vulnerable patient from infection is very different from trying to isolate an infected patient who might then spread it to other patients in the same facility. They're very different infection control procedures. And so you had to train the staff as well. But now that we've done it, and it took 6 months, even in the middle of a pandemic, for a lot of hospitals to actually get the logistics sorted out. Now that we've done it, those protocols are there. That training, those facilities and so forth should not simply be mothballed. The protocols shouldn't simply be lost. And then the last bit is really funding between pandemics, because the big problem with infectious diseases as a whole is that infectious diseases tend to be really, really lumpy. In terms of industry, what you want is a constant revenue stream from cancer or rheumatology or cardiac disease or respiratory disease, a constant income flow so that you can actually run your business, so you can actually pay salaries, so you can keep facilities running. But because infectious diseases come in waves, when you're busy, you're really busy. When there's nothing, there literally is nothing to do. And so that funding model, industry finds very, very difficult to cope with, especially when industry tends to work on quarterly business reporting cycles, annual reports, not on a 10-year timescale, which is what pandemics actually require. And that's when you get, you find a role for organizations such as governments, such as non-governmental funders, such as the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation, because individual companies find it very, very difficult to work with such a lumpy workflow and revenue stream.
That's absolutely fascinating. I had no idea that the work that had been going on that you just described had unfolded for everybody. And I love the description you gave of Singapore as well. I thought that's something we really should be paying attention to.
I think that Singapore is an important model of how to do it right. I'm biased because I'm from Singapore, but generally speaking, you can divide the countries of the world into two. Those who locked down early, but then generally failed to roll out their vaccines very quickly or effectively. And I'm sorry to say that I would put Australia and New Zealand into that kind of bucket. They locked down very early and they did so extremely effectively. But then after that, when the vaccines came out, really failed to vaccinate their populations quickly enough. And then I think the UK and US probably fall into the other bucket, where lockdowns happened early, then controls actually failed quite quickly. Disease spread quite quickly before vaccines were actually freely available. But then when the vaccines were available, the UK in particular vaccinated its population very, very quickly and effectively. Singapore is one of the few countries that actually managed to do both.
Okay. Tell me, with regards to the regulatory environment, do you think it should be under the Medicines Agency, or should there be something else that's a little more, perhaps a little more flexible?
I think the job of the regulator is the job of the regulator. I think it would be wrong to take that away. I think the UK MHRA in particular has tried to be flexible. Certainly with vaccines, they worked really, really hard to ensure that reviews and approvals happened as quickly as possible in as timely a fashion as possible. Not all of the regulators, however, were on the same page. There was not as much coordination between regulators as I thought there should have been. And in particular, regulatory requirements for the next generation of monoclonal antibodies, there's now a very significant disconnect between the US and Europe. The US is treating monoclonal antibodies very much more like small molecules, asking for quite a high standard of evidence. In fact, full efficacy trials is what I'm hearing, full phase 3 trials, which really doesn't make sense at all from a scientific point of view. Europe is probably more flexible, but then for a manufacturer, this then creates huge problems because you can't have clinical trials just for half the world and not for the other, and then having to run a completely different clinical trial for the other half of the world. I mean, this becomes incredibly expensive. And this for a treatment platform, which at the moment I've said is probably 10 to 100 times more expensive than a vaccine. This does not help to bring costs down. It does completely the opposite. And it also means that manufacturers, drug developers are on the back foot, and you're far less flexible. You have to be more reactive because you find yourself constantly having to go back to the regulator to ask, is this okay with you? Okay, Europe have said that this is okay. US, is this okay with you? Oh, no, it's not. Okay, we have to change this. Okay, we go back to Europe again. And this then introduces months of delay, which in the context of a pandemic, you simply can't afford. You cannot afford that kind of delay because, as I've said, every month in the context of a pandemic is thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives.
Interesting. I'll say, Dr. Koh, thank you very much. It's been fantastic to have you on board today, and we've learned a great deal. And for myself personally, I'm very grateful for this conversation. I hope we can talk to you again in maybe 6 or 12 months and learn about your next venture.
Absolutely delighted to do so.